High upon the hills, the castles of medieval Europe rose like stone giants, their towers piercing the sky, their walls thick and unyielding. For kings and lords, they were symbols of power and prestige, fortresses meant to protect, to inspire awe, to assert dominion over the land below. Yet for those trapped within when the shadow of a siege fell, these same walls became prisons, cold and merciless, holding fear, hunger, and death within their stone embrace. The story of the siege is one of contrasts, of might versus ingenuity, courage versus despair, and life against the ever-present specter of death. Castles were never just buildings. They were living entities resonating with the footsteps of soldiers, the whispers of spies, and the cries of those caught in the unforgiving machinery of war. Today we journey through these walls, through the echo of stone, to witness the brutality, the heroism, and the human cost of medieval sieges. Imagine standing at the base of a towering stone wall. The sun glints off the battlements, but shadows gather in the corners, where defenders keep watch. The air is tense with anticipation. Every day the castle's occupants know that enemies may be circling, planning, waiting. Siege engines could appear on the horizon, catapults hunched and ready, trebuchets poised like giant arms waiting to fling death. The castle may seem impregnable, but nothing lasts forever. Fortresses were designed to withstand prolonged assaults. Thick walls, sometimes over 30 feet high, were reinforced with stone and mortar that had withstood decades, even centuries. Moats and ditches created deadly obstacles for attackers, forcing them into narrow, exposed approaches where every footfall could be met with arrows, boiling oil, or heavy stones dropped from above. Towers provided vantage points, allowing archers to rain death on approaching enemies. Every architectural decision had a purpose: to protect, to intimidate, to survive. But no fortress, no matter how perfectly constructed, could escape the ingenuity of its enemies. Siege warfare was an art, and the greatest tacticians treated it as such. Engineers designed massive machines capable of hurling projectiles that could crush walls and tear through gates. Miners dug tunnels beneath fortifications, aiming to collapse towers from below. Scouts and spies infiltrated hidden paths, seeking to betray from within. Attackers studied weaknesses while defenders adapted to every new threat. Every stone could be a shield, every shadow a potential trap. Inside the castle, life was a delicate balance between vigilance and survival. Soldiers patrolled the ramparts, their armor clanking, their eyes scanning for the first sign of movement beyond the walls. Servants carried water, prepared meals, and tended to the wounded, all under the shadow of impending attack. Families, often living within the walls, huddled in cellars and storerooms, their fear palpable. The screams of children and the prayers of the elderly were carried along corridors and through cold stone halls, becoming part of the castle's own soundscape. The psychological pressure of a siege was relentless. Days could stretch into weeks, weeks into months. The knowledge that enemies were closing in, that resources might run out, that betrayal could strike from inside, gnawed at the minds of those trapped within. And yet, for all the fear, the walls also inspired courage. Every arrow fired from the battlements, every stone rolled down a slope, every defensive strategy executed was a testament to human will and determination. These were not passive structures. They were theaters of human drama, where bravery, desperation, and ingenuity intertwined. Beyond the walls, the attackers prepared with equal diligence and cunning. Siege engines were tested and rebuilt, trebuchets adjusted for accuracy, catapults loaded with stones, incendiaries, or even disease-ridden corpses to weaken morale. Armies encamped outside the castle, building temporary fortifications to protect themselves from counterattacks. They endured exposure, disease, and the constant threat of sudden skirmishes. The strategy was not only to destroy walls but to exhaust the defenders, to wear down the spirit until surrender became inevitable. Throughout history, sieges shaped the rise and fall of kingdoms. Castles that seemed indomitable fell to clever tactics, superior numbers, or sheer persistence. The stories recorded in chronicles tell of commanders who outwitted defenders, of engineers who created weapons so effective that entire fortresses crumbled. Yet, just as often, the defenders demonstrated extraordinary resilience, turning potential defeat into legendary heroism. Every stone in a castle has a story. Every wall, every gate, every arrow slit has witnessed human triumph and tragedy. They have seen families torn apart, armies crushed, alliances broken, and loyalty tested. They have heard the whispers of strategy, the cries of the wounded, and the silent prayers of those who faced certain death. And while the sounds of battle may have faded, the echoes remain, echoes of stone, echoes of shadows, echoes of a time when survival depended on courage, ingenuity, and an unyielding will. Today, many of these castles lie in ruins, silent witnesses to their turbulent past. Travelers report feeling the weight of history, imagining the clatter of weapons, the roar of engines, the cries of those trapped within. In the shadow of these ancient walls, it is possible to sense the stories etched into every stone, the memory of human struggle, fear, and resilience. The echo of stone reminds us that history is never truly silent. As we begin this journey, remember, we are not merely recounting battles or listing weapons. We are stepping into the lives of those who lived, fought, and sometimes perished within these walls. We are listening to the whispers of the past, learning from their courage and understanding the grim realities of medieval warfare. The siege is both a story of destruction and of endurance, a story where every wall has a voice, every shadow hides a memory, and every echo tells a tale of humanity at its most tested. Welcome, then, to the shadows of the siege, to the walls of stone and fear. The journey begins here. The medieval battlefield was not won by swords alone. Behind every successful siege lay the genius and brutality of engineering. The castles that rose like stone giants were formidable, but for those determined to conquer, every wall, every gate, and every tower was a challenge that demanded ingenuity, force, and relentless perseverance. Among the most feared instruments of siege were the catapults and trebuchets. While both were designed to hurl massive projectiles, their methods and effects differed. Catapults relied on tension, often from twisted ropes or flexed wooden beams, to fling stones the size of a man or even larger. Each launch required precision and timing. The impact could shatter walls, crush towers, and strike terror into the hearts of defenders. Trebuchets, however, were engineering marvels. Massive counterweights, sometimes weighing several tons, propelled arms that could fling enormous boulders over long distances. The sound of a trebuchet in motion, its arms swinging, the rope snapping into place, the projectile hurtling through the air, was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. One successful strike could bring a wall crumbling down in moments, turning a fortress that seemed impregnable into rubble. Then there were battering rams. Simple in concept, devastating in effect, these reinforced wooden beams were swung against gates and doors, often coated with iron at the tip to crush stone and wood alike. Teams of men would coordinate every swing, moving in rhythm, bracing against counterweights, all while defenders rained arrows, boiling oil, and stones upon them. A single misstep could kill several men instantly, yet the determination to breach the walls often overpowered fear. Siege towers added yet another layer of dread. On wheels, these mobile fortresses allowed attackers to approach walls while protected from arrows and fire. From their elevated platforms, archers could shoot at the defenders with near-equal advantage. The sight of a massive wooden tower slowly advancing across the battlefield, shields gleaming, engines humming with motion, filled even seasoned soldiers with apprehension. Defenders would do everything in their power to halt these towers, fire arrows, pour boiling pitch, or collapse makeshift barriers. The battle of ingenuity against fortification was constant, with the slightest miscalculation proving deadly. The engineers behind these machines were as crucial as the warriors who wielded them. They combined knowledge of physics, mathematics, and mechanics with an intimate understanding of human psychology. Every projectile had to be calculated for weight, trajectory, and impact. Every siege engine reinforced and maintained to withstand counterattacks and weather. Miners dug tunnels beneath walls, seeking to collapse towers from below. Engineers devised nets, counterweights, and ramps to shield their machines and optimize efficiency. Their success or failure could determine the fate of thousands. Psychological warfare was often as effective as physical destruction. Chronicles recount catapults hurling not only stones but decapitated heads, rotting corpses, and other horrifying projectiles. The aim was to terrify defenders, to erode morale before walls were even breached. Incendiary devices, clay pots filled with tar, pitch, and sulfur, would ignite on impact, setting wooden structures ablaze, forcing defenders to divide their attention between fighting fires and fighting the attackers. The battlefield became a symphony of chaos, the thunder of stones, the crackle of flames, the screams of the wounded, and the shouts of soldiers coordinating attacks. Attacking a fortress was not simply a matter of strength. It was a battle of persistence. Weeks and even months could pass with little visible progress. Trebuchets fired relentlessly, battering rams struck at gates day after day, and siege towers crept forward inch by inch. Supplies ran low, diseases spread among encamped soldiers, and morale wavered. The smallest error in calculation could destroy a machine or worse, injure the men operating it. And yet, Determination often overcame exhaustion, ingenuity triumphed over adversity, and slowly, ever so slowly, the walls of stone began to show cracks. The defenders, for their part, were equally ingenious. Every wall, every tower, every loophole was an opportunity to strike back. Stones and boiling oil were dropped upon attackers, arrows rained down with deadly precision, and traps awaited the unwary. Some castles even had concealed murder holes, openings in the ceilings of gateways and corridors, through which defenders could pour boiling water, molten lead, or sand onto enemies. In this deadly chess game, every decision mattered. One failed maneuver could mean the fall of a gate. One brilliant defensive strategy could prolong resistance for weeks. The human cost of these engines of war was immense. Soldiers manning catapults, trebuchets, and battering rams risked their lives with every swing, every launch. Injuries were common, and death could arrive in an instant. The strain on the body and mind was immense. Long hours, poor food, exposure to the elements, and constant danger created exhaustion that rivaled the fear of enemy attacks. Despite this, men worked tirelessly, driven by duty, ambition, or desperation, knowing that success could bring honor and failure, death. The consequences of siege engineering were profound. Entire fortresses could fall because of a single well-placed boulder or the collapse of a key gate. Cities that seemed secure for decades crumbled under the relentless pressure of siege machinery. Commanders who mastered these engines of destruction often wrote their names into history. Yet, just as often, defenders found ways to adapt, counter, and endure, creating stories of legendary heroism and strategic brilliance. Beyond the mechanics of war, these machines symbolize human ingenuity in the face of extreme challenges. They reflect the balance between creativity and destruction, the marriage of intellect and brute force. They demonstrate that even in the darkest times, humans find ways to solve problems, to innovate, and to impose will upon their world. When a wall finally gave way, when a gate splintered under the repeated blows of a battering ram, the siege entered a new phase. What had begun as a display of skill and power transformed into a race against time. Attackers rushed through breaches, defenders fought to repel them, and the fate of everyone within the fortress hung in balance. The engines of doom had done their work, but the human drama was far from over. And so, the story of siege warfare is not merely a story of stone and wood, of catapults and trebuchets. It is a story of courage and fear, of ingenuity and destruction, of survival against overwhelming odds. Each machine, each strike, each defensive maneuver contributes to the larger narrative of human conflict. A narrative written in sweat, blood, and stone, echoing through the ages. While the walls of a castle might withstand the heaviest stones, and the gates might repel the fiercest blows, there was an enemy the defenders could not easily fight with swords or arrows: hunger. The siege was not merely a battle of strength and engineering, it was a war of patience, endurance, and deprivation. The longer a fortress held out, the more precarious life became within its walls. In the early days of a siege, food supplies were rationed carefully. Soldiers and civilians alike relied on stored grain, salted meat, and whatever provisions had been amassed in preparation for the inevitable. But as the days stretched into weeks and the weeks into months, these stores dwindled. Every meal was measured, every bite calculated to stretch supplies. Even then, hunger gnawed at the stomach and the mind, becoming a silent but relentless force. Chroniclers of medieval warfare often describe the horrifying extremes to which people went in these circumstances. When food ran out, rats, mice, and other vermin became sources of desperate sustenance. Horses, once proud companions and beasts of burden, were slaughtered for their meat. And in the most extreme cases, humans turned to cannibalism, a grim testament to the lengths to which desperation could drive the soul. These were not tales of reckless indulgence. They were acts of survival, forced by circumstance and fear. Hunger was more than a physical torment, it was psychological. Every empty stomach, every whispered complaint, every trembling hand reflected the mounting despair. Children grew weak and pale, their laughter replaced by silent whimpers. Elders, already frail, often succumbed to illness exacerbated by malnutrition. Soldiers, once disciplined and determined, found their focus slipping. A sharp mind dulled by the gnawing pain of emptiness could no longer anticipate attacks, manage defenses, or maintain the morale of those around them. Leaders within the castle faced impossible choices. How much food could be spared for the sick and wounded? How could provisions be rationed without inciting panic or revolt among the population? Every decision carried moral weight and strategic consequence. A single misstep could result in mass suffering, weakened defenses, or even death. The commanders knew that the outcome of a siege often depended not only on the walls themselves but on their ability to sustain life within those walls. Outside, the attackers understood this vulnerability. While trebuchets smashed stone, and battering rams battered gates, the enemy within was silently being weakened from another direction. Siege warfare often relied on patience as much as brute force. Starvation could be as effective as a trebuchet, as lethal as any weapon. The longer the defenders went without adequate nutrition, the more likely they were to surrender or break under the combined strain of fatigue, fear, and hunger. Diaries and chronicles recount heartbreaking scenes from these times. Families huddled together in dark corners, their children too weak to move without assistance. Soldiers, their bodies emaciated, struggled to lift weapons, their arms trembling with the effort. Every day, ration meals grew smaller, and yet the demand for strength remained constant. Beyond the physical and psychological toll, hunger also influenced the social dynamics within the fortress. Alliances fractured, tempers flared, and jealousy or resentment could turn neighbors against one another. Civilians blamed soldiers for mismanagement of provisions. Soldiers blamed leaders for poor strategy. In these cramped and desperate conditions, the line between order and chaos became dangerously thin. Interestingly, some defenders developed extraordinary measures to cope. Communities devised rationing systems, underground caches, and even small-scale hunting expeditions within the castle grounds. Secret stores of grain were hidden away, sometimes discovered only by chance after the siege ended. Every tiny victory, a loaf of bread saved, a handful of grain found, was celebrated as a triumph against the relentless pressure of starvation. The physical manifestations of hunger were unmistakable. Swollen bellies, sunken eyes, gaunt faces, and weakened bodies testified to the slow, steady destruction of life from within. Illnesses spread more easily among the malnourished, turning minor injuries into fatal complications. The human spirit was tested as severely as the castle walls, and often the fight for survival became more grueling than the fight against the enemy outside. In some sieges, the defenders attempted desperate measures to break the stranglehold of famine. Foraging missions beyond the walls, risky and sometimes fatal, were launched to secure fresh food. Small sorties might bring back livestock, herbs, or other sustenance, but the cost was high. Each venture beyond the protective stone exposed men to arrows, ambushes, or the perils of open terrain. Yet these missions were sometimes the difference between life and death, hope and despair. Beyond the immediate physical suffering, hunger reshaped the culture and character of those within. Stories of courage and resilience often arose from the darkest moments. People found ways to maintain dignity, to protect children, to assist the weak, even as the shadow of death loomed. These tales were preserved in chronicles, passed down through generations, serving as reminders of human endurance under extreme duress. Hunger, ultimately, was a siege engine of its own, a silent, invisible adversary that struck at the heart of every castle. It could erode willpower, compromise defense, and force surrender without a single stone thrown. Those who survived these periods of deprivation were often changed irrevocably, their strength and endurance tested in ways that few battles could rival. As we reflect on this chapter of siege warfare, it becomes clear that medieval conflicts were as much about human endurance as military might. The engines of stone and wood were terrifying, but the slow, inexorable force of hunger was perhaps the cruelest weapon of all. It consumed not only the body but the mind, challenging every defender to endure, adapt, and survive. In the quiet desperation of empty kitchens and silent corridors, the true human cost of war became evident, unseen, relentless, and unforgettable. While hunger weakened the body and siege engines shattered walls, medieval warfare held an even darker, more insidious threat: the contamination of water and the deliberate use of disease as a weapon. Castles, despite their fortifications, depended on wells, cisterns, and streams for life-giving water. When those sources were poisoned, the consequences were swift and horrifying. Siege warfare was not merely physical, it was psychological. Commanders understood that the mind could be as fragile as the body. The knowledge that every sip of water might bring sickness or death created a constant, gnawing fear within the castle walls. Soldiers and civilians alike were forced to drink cautiously, rations of water were measured with suspicion, and the presence of illness could spark panic before any weapon had been fired. Armies employed a grim array of tactics to turn water into a weapon. Corpses of humans and animals, often infected with plague, were thrown into wells or nearby rivers. The stench was immediate, the water rendered foul, and the morale of the defenders plummeted. It was not only a question of survival but also a test of mental endurance. Knowing that sustenance could be laced with death, and that anyone drinking might succumb to disease. Chroniclers record horrifying episodes. One castle might fall not to a catapult or a battering ram but to the slow, invisible siege of infection. Soldiers fell ill with fever, dysentery or plague. Children grew weak, and elders succumbed to ailments that would otherwise have been survivable. Every cough, every sudden fever, every pallor among the defenders heightened anxiety and distrust, eroding unity and morale. In some cases, attackers went further, contaminating the land itself. Fields outside castle walls were littered with diseased carcasses, tainted produce, and refuse designed to prevent foraging. This ensured that even daring attempts to secure food or water outside the walls were met with risk of sickness. The siege became not just a matter of force but a war against life itself. The psychological effects were profound. Soldiers could be perfectly trained, highly disciplined, and well-armed, yet the invisible enemy of disease undermined their confidence. Trust faltered. Families hid their sick from public view, fearful of spreading panic. Leaders struggled to maintain order as anxiety spread like wildfire. In many cases, castles surrendered not because their walls had fallen, but because the invisible siege of sickness and contamination made continued resistance impossible. Even when wells were not directly poisoned, the stress of siege conditions, overcrowding, poor sanitation and limited nutrition, made outbreaks almost inevitable. Latrines overflowed, garbage accumulated, and water sources could become compromised by mere neglect. Disease was an ever-present companion, silently striking at the strongest, most prepared defenders. The threat of contagion added another layer of fear to the already brutal experience of siege warfare. Some defenders attempted ingenious countermeasures. Water was boiled, filtered, or rationed carefully. Hidden cisterns were maintained in secret, and supply lines were sometimes established to bring in fresh water under the cover of night. Yet these measures could only mitigate the threat, not eliminate it. The attackers, meanwhile, adapted, seeking new ways to exploit weaknesses and to amplify the terror caused by contamination. Historical records describe terrifying psychological ploys as well. Messages might be sent threatening the poisoning of water supplies, rumors of disease deliberately spread, or corpses displayed at the walls to unsettle defenders. The goal was simple: weaken resolve, disrupt discipline, and make surrender more likely. In these ways, medieval warfare was as much a battle of the mind as of the body. Poison in the well also underscores the medieval understanding of warfare as total. It was not limited to the combatants. Civilians, children, the elderly, all were affected by the strategies employed. The suffering of non-combatants was a deliberate tool, a grim reminder that survival depended not only on skill with weapons, but also on endurance, fortitude, and sometimes sheer luck. Beyond the physical and mental toll, the practice of contaminating water reveals the cunning and ruthlessness of siege commanders. These were men who understood that victory could be achieved not only by storming gates, but by breaking the human spirit. Every diseased corpse, every poisoned well, every whispered threat added to a growing atmosphere of fear and hopelessness. Resistance became an act of courage, defiance in the face of a pervasive and unseen enemy. The human stories from these sieges are haunting. Families hiding from sickness in cramped spaces, children too weak to rise from their beds, soldiers trying to carry out their duties while their bodies betrayed them. Every cough, every fevered delirium became a reminder of mortality. Yet even in these dire circumstances, acts of bravery, compassion, and ingenuity emerged. People shared what little clean water remained, tended to the sick despite their own risk, and found ways to endure when survival seemed impossible. The long-term effects of these campaigns were also significant. Survivors often bore scars, physical, psychological, and emotional, that lasted long after the siege ended. Entire communities could be decimated, altering the demographic and political landscape. Castles, once thought impregnable, fell not merely to weapons, but to the relentless, silent assault of disease and contamination. In contemplating this dark aspect of medieval warfare, one must recognize the sheer ingenuity and cruelty of both attacker and defender. Each side adapted to circumstances, sought advantage, and employed every tool at their disposal. Siege warfare was a multidimensional struggle. Stone, fire, hunger, and disease all intertwined to test the limits of human endurance. The poisoned well is emblematic of the unseen threats that define siege warfare. While walls and battlements are visible and tangible, the danger of disease was invisible, creeping silently, striking unpredictably. It was a reminder that in war not all enemies wear armor, and not all threats can be met with sword or shield. To survive required courage, vigilance, and an understanding that sometimes, the battle was as much against circumstance as against any human foe. And so, the story of the poisoned well reminds us that siege warfare was total and merciless. It was not merely a contest of strength, skill, or courage. It was a battle for life itself, waged on physical, mental, and moral fronts. It illustrates the enduring human struggle to survive under conditions designed to break body, mind, and spirit. In the shadows of stone, in the silence of wells, and in the quiet desperation of those trapped within, the echoes of suffering and resilience continue to resonate through history. While hunger and poisoned water sapped the body and siege engines battered the stone, there existed a force of destruction as immediate as it was terrifying: fire. Flames could reduce the proudest fortresses to smoldering ruins, turning towers into infernos and hallways into death traps. Siege by fire was a weapon both physical and psychological, capable of overwhelming the strongest defenses and the bravest hearts. Fire was everywhere in medieval warfare. Arrows tipped with flammable pitch, pots of tar hurled over battlements, and flaming projectiles launched from catapults or trebuchets transformed the battlefield into a landscape of smoke, heat, and terror. Even the most meticulously constructed wooden doors, roofs, and walkways became fuel for the inferno. Within moments, a single spark could set entire sections of a castle ablaze, forcing defenders to choose between fighting the flames or facing the enemy. The strategy of using fire was both practical and psychological. Defenders, already stretched thin, were forced to divert manpower to extinguish flames, leaving other areas vulnerable. Smoke filled corridors and stairwells, blinding soldiers and choking civilians. The heat was relentless, searing armor, scorching flesh, and making every step an ordeal. Panic spread as quickly as the flames, undermining discipline and morale. Even a well-trained garrison could crumble under the dual threats of fire and enemy assault. Attacking forces often exploited the vulnerability of wooden structures. Roof beams, gates, scaffolding, and hoardings, all essential to the castle's defense, could be ignited and collapsed strategically to maximize damage. Siege engineers understood that fire was not merely destructive, it was a force multiplier, amplifying the effect of every attack. A gate weakened by battering rams might give way more quickly if the surrounding structure was engulfed in flames. A siege tower approaching a wall could be forced back if defenders set fire to the ground beneath it. Accounts from historical sieges describe terrifying scenes. The roofs of towers catching fire and collapsing with a deafening crash. Smoke curling through arrow slits and stairwells, suffocating anyone in its path. Wooden floors igniting underfoot, sending soldiers tumbling into the chaos below. Families huddled in cellars, watching the world above burn, knowing that escape was impossible. The visual horror of fire was matched only by its sound: crackling, snapping, groaning beams, and the screams of those trapped or injured. Fire was also an instrument of terror and intimidation. The sight of flames consuming parts of the castle signaled impending doom. Even those not directly affected by the fire experienced psychological strain. The constant threat of heat, the smell of smoke, the knowledge that any section could ignite at any moment. Morale was as fragile as the wooden beams. Fear spread faster than the flames themselves. Defenders developed countermeasures, though these often required ingenuity and courage. Buckets of water, wet hides, and sand were used to smother flames. Fire breaks were constructed, and strategic removal of flammable materials slowed the spread. Yet even with these measures, the unpredictability of fire meant that luck often played as large a role as skill. A sudden gust of wind, a misthrown arrow, or an overlooked timber could turn a controlled blaze into uncontrollable destruction. The human cost of siege by fire was immense. Soldiers tasked with extinguishing flames risked life and limb. Civilians trapped in upper floors or roof chambers faced impossible choices. Injuries from burns were common, often fatal given the medical knowledge of the time. And beyond the immediate physical danger, the stress, terror, and chaos inflicted deep psychological scars on survivors. Many chroniclers recount the haunting memories of flames consuming familiar spaces, turning home into death trap in mere moments. Fire also played a role in offensive strategy beyond destruction. Flames could be used to create diversions, drawing defenders away from critical points. They could force movement, channeling defenders into vulnerable positions or cutting off escape routes. The attackers' understanding of fire as both a weapon and a tool of strategy demonstrated their adaptability and cunning, making it clear that medieval warfare was as much about mental acuity as brute strength. In some sieges, fire combined with other siege tactics to devastating effect. Trebuchets could launch flaming projectiles into densely packed areas, compounding the damage of falling stones. Battering rams and siege towers advanced while defenders fought both flames and attackers. Poisoned wells or food shortages amplified the effects, creating an environment where survival became increasingly uncertain. The synergy of these tactics demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of multi-layered warfare, with fire as a central and terrifying component. Historical accounts from castles under siege describe moments when entire sections of walls were engulfed, forcing defenders to retreat to inner bailies, only to find themselves trapped in smaller, smoke-filled enclosures. Stairways became death traps, wooden floors collapsed under the heat, and gates warped from the intense temperature, leaving defenders stranded. The combination of fire, smoke, and psychological pressure often forced surrender without the enemy ever breaching the main walls. Yet, even in the face of fire, acts of extraordinary bravery emerged. Soldiers ran into burning chambers to rescue comrades or civilians. Commanders directed troops through smoke-filled corridors to maintain defense. Families protected children from falling debris and scalding heat. These moments of heroism stand out in the grim narrative of siege warfare, reminding us that courage and human endurance persist even in the most harrowing conditions. Fire was not merely a tool, it was a living adversary, unpredictable, relentless, and indiscriminate. It consumed everything in its path, wood, fabric, flesh, and demanded constant vigilance. Those who survived such sieges carried the memories of flames, both as a testament to destruction and as a symbol of human resilience. In reflecting on the siege by fire, one must appreciate both the destructiveness and strategic significance of flames in medieval warfare. Fire was a force that could penetrate stone defenses, challenge human courage, and turn the tide of battle. It was a weapon of both terror and efficiency, testing not only walls but the endurance, ingenuity, and spirit of all who lived under its shadow. And so, the story of the fire siege reminds us that medieval castles, for all their strength, were not immune to the elemental forces that humans could harness. Flames, smoke, and heat became agents of war, shaping history, inspiring fear, and leaving an indelible mark on the memory of those who faced them. In the end, survival required courage, resourcefulness, and the resolve to endure the inferno, a testament to human determination in the face of unstoppable destruction. When night fell over the castle, darkness became both a shield and a weapon. The sun's departure did not bring rest or relief to the defenders. Instead, it ushered in a different kind of terror, a terror born not from the thunder of siege engines or the crack of flames, but from the invisible movements and whispered threats that moved under the cover of shadows. The silent night was a battlefield in its own right, where fear crept along corridors and stealth became deadly. Darkness provided attackers with opportunities that daylight often denied. Small teams of soldiers, masked by night, could approach walls undetected, attempting to scale battlements or sabotage gates. Archers and crossbowmen lurked in the shadows beyond the moat, aiming for those on the parapets. Sentries, relying only on their senses, strained to detect movement, every rustle of leaves or shift of wind sounding like a threat. In these hours, perception became survival. One misstep, one overlooked movement, and a fatal blow could strike from the darkness. Tunnels and sapping were among the deadliest tools of nocturnal siege tactics. Attackers would dig beneath walls or towers, aiming to collapse them from below. The sounds of hammering, digging, and shifting soil were muffled, leaving defenders unaware until a tower suddenly crumbled or a section of wall collapsed. Fear of subterranean attack gnawed at the minds of those within. Every night, soldiers and civilians alike lay awake, listening for the faintest signs of intrusion, knowing that even a single tunnel could determine the fate of the fortress. Infiltration and espionage were equally potent under the cover of darkness. Spies, bribed guards, or disgruntled servants could open gates, disable defenses, or provide vital intelligence to the enemy. These acts of betrayal were silent, unseen, and devastating. The knowledge that a traitor might lurk within the castle walls eroded trust, sowing tension among defenders. Families, soldiers, and commanders lived in constant uncertainty, unsure who could be relied upon. In such a fragile environment, fear itself became a weapon. The psychological impact of the silent night cannot be overstated. Fear thrives in darkness. Shadows became imagined enemies. Every sound, every movement, was interpreted as a threat. Sentries doubled their vigilance, hearts racing at the slightest noise. Civilians huddled in cellars and storage rooms, praying or whispering reassurances to one another. Even those trained for battle could feel their resolve waver under the constant pressure of unseen danger. Night was as much an adversary as any army, challenging courage and composure alike. Not all nocturnal attacks were subtle. Sometimes, attackers set fires at strategic locations to create confusion, forcing defenders to divide attention between fighting flames and repelling soldiers. Others used loud noises, hitting drums, banging metal, shouting false commands, to disorient and intimidate. In the darkness, chaos multiplied, and even small forces could achieve disproportionate effects. Stories from medieval chronicles describe moments of pure terror. A small party of infiltrators might descend from the roof, silently killing sentries before opening a gate for the larger force. Guards patrolling in pitch-black corridors could stumble into traps or ambushes. Families and children, awakened by screams or the clatter of weapons, were caught in the crossfire of fear and strategy. The castle, normally a sanctuary, became a labyrinth of peril. Leaders faced extraordinary challenges during the silent night. Maintaining discipline, coordinating patrols, and ensuring vigilance required constant attention. Mistakes were magnified in darkness. A single lapse in watch could allow attackers to penetrate defenses, sabotage key structures, or capture critical positions. The responsibility weighed heavily on those in command, as the lives of soldiers and civilians alike depended on their decisions. Despite the fear, defenders displayed remarkable resilience. Night raids were countered with vigilance, careful planning, and ingenuity. Watchfires, lanterns, and sound signals were used to alert others to danger. Rotating patrols ensured that eyes remained sharp, and secret compartments or hidden corridors provided escape or defensive advantage. Courage often shone brightest in darkness, when the stakes were highest, and every decision could mean life or death. The silent night also fostered unique strategies of survival for non-combatants. Families reinforced doors, created hiding places, and shared whispered instructions. Children were kept calm through storytelling or songs, attempting to mask the terror that surrounded them. These small acts of ingenuity and courage were critical to endurance, demonstrating that heroism during a siege was not limited to soldiers alone. Night assaults also demonstrated the contrast between human ingenuity and the limits of technology. While siege engines were powerful in daylight, under darkness they were often useless. Human cunning, stealth, and adaptability became the decisive factors. A small, agile force could outmaneuver a larger, better-equipped garrison if the defenders were not vigilant. The balance of power shifted, proving that battles were as much mental and strategic as they were physical. Sleep became a scarce commodity within the walls. Exhaustion compounded fear, dulling reflexes and clouding judgment. Soldiers struggled to stay alert, patrolling for hours on end, while civilians endured sleepless nights in cramped quarters. Dreams were haunted by imagined threats. Waking hours were dominated by real ones. In this environment, the silent night tested the limits of human endurance, patience, and mental fortitude. In the end, the silent night was a microcosm of siege warfare itself, unpredictable, relentless, and terrifying. It magnified the vulnerabilities of stone and flesh alike, showing that even the strongest walls could not entirely shield their inhabitants from fear, cunning, and death. Every shadow held potential peril, every sound a possible signal of attack, and every moment demanded vigilance. And yet, amid the terror, moments of bravery and ingenuity illuminated the darkness. Soldiers moved through shadows to protect their comrades, leaders made split-second decisions to avert disaster, families found ways to comfort one another despite fear. These acts were reminders that human resilience can endure even in the most oppressive circumstances. The silent night teaches us that siege warfare was as much about endurance, vigilance, and psychological strength as it was about weapons or fortifications. It was a battle against unseen enemies, where courage, adaptability, and perseverance determined survival. Within the darkness, the echoes of fear and hope intertwined, shaping history in ways that stone walls alone could not capture. As we leave this chapter of the siege, we recognize that night was both ally and adversary, an environment where shadows concealed danger, cunning triumphed over brute force, and every heartbeat measured the fragile boundary between life and death. In the silent night, the human spirit was tested as fiercely as the stone walls themselves, revealing the enduring resilience that defines those who face overwhelming odds. While soldiers fought on the battlements and siege engines thundered against stone, another, often overlooked group faced the silent horrors of war, the civilians trapped within the castle walls. Among them were children, women, and the elderly, those for whom swords and strategy held little meaning, yet whose survival depended on courage, ingenuity, and sheer endurance. In the shadows of stone, their lives were transformed into a desperate struggle against fear, hunger, and the constant threat of death. Children, in particular, experienced the siege in ways both vivid and terrifying. Their days were marked by the clatter of war, the roar of trebuchets, the crackle of fire, the relentless pounding of battering rams. Nights offered no reprieve. In the darkness, fear became tangible, shadows twisted into imagined monsters, and every sound, footsteps, whispers, distant shouts, was a potential threat. The youngest often clung to parents or older siblings, seeking comfort in a world that seemed suddenly hostile and unpredictable. Stories from medieval chronicles reveal how children adapted, sometimes in astonishing ways. Some assisted adults by carrying water, gathering firewood, or delivering messages through narrow corridors. Others found hiding places in attics, cellars, and storage rooms, learning to move silently to avoid danger. Even in their fear, these children demonstrated resilience, courage, and adaptability that rivaled that of trained soldiers. Women too bore a unique burden during sieges. Responsible for both caring for the sick and maintaining households under siege conditions, they faced unrelenting stress. Many acted as nurses, tending to the wounded and sick while managing scarce resources. They rationed food for children and the elderly, monitored water supplies, and maintained some semblance of order amidst chaos. Their labor often went unnoticed in chronicles dominated by tales of battles and heroics, yet without their efforts, survival would have been far more precarious. Elderly residents faced particular vulnerability. Their frail bodies struggled against the effects of hunger, exposure, and illness. The stress of constant bombardment, smoke, and uncertainty took a severe toll. Many relied on the care of younger family members or neighbors, creating intricate networks of support that became essential to the community's survival. Their wisdom, however, also proved invaluable. Older residents often advised leaders on resource management, safe hiding places, and strategies to endure prolonged siege conditions. Fear was omnipresent. Even well-fortified castles could feel like traps when children cried in hidden corners, fires burned nearby, and the distant roar of engines echoed through stone corridors. Every knock on a door, every shadow across a wall, was a potential omen. Panic could spread as quickly as flames, and maintaining morale became a constant struggle. Leaders and parents alike had to balance vigilance with reassurance, ensuring that children and civilians retained hope even in dire circumstances. The psychological toll was compounded by isolation. Families were often cut off from the outside world, unable to communicate with allies or receive reinforcements. Supplies dwindled, water sources could be contaminated, and the threat of disease lingered like an invisible predator. Children grew weaker, their games replaced by tasks of survival. Adolescents assumed responsibilities beyond their years, carrying water, assisting in makeshift kitchens, or standing guard alongside soldiers. They became part of the defense system, their survival intertwined with the fate of the fortress. Chroniclers recount the tragic consequences when fortresses fell. Children hidden in cellars or crypts were sometimes trapped beneath collapsing walls, lost in the chaos of conquest. Families were torn apart, many survivors enslaved or executed by victorious forces. The experiences of these young ones, often overlooked in history, reflect the grim reality that sieges were total wars, affecting every segment of the population. Yet even amid despair, acts of courage and resilience shone. Children helped one another navigate smoke-filled corridors, women distributed rations and comforted the frightened, and elders offered guidance to those struggling to cope. Communities found ways to maintain solidarity, sharing scarce resources and protecting the weakest. These acts of humanity under extreme stress became stories of hope that survived long after the walls fell silent. Tales from sieges also emphasize ingenuity. Civilians devised clever methods to survive: secret caches of food hidden beneath floors, tunnels providing escape or access to fresh water, and improvised alarms to alert of breaches or fires. In some instances, children and young adults became messengers, slipping through enemy lines to carry critical information. The ingenuity of non-combatants often proved as vital to survival as the skill of soldiers on the battlements. The suffering of civilians also shaped the moral and ethical landscape of siege warfare. Commanders had to consider not only the strategic value of a target but also the human cost. Chroniclers note instances where attackers deliberately spared children or non-combatants, and equally moments where fear and revenge led to tragic outcomes. The presence of vulnerable populations added layers of complexity, heightening both the stakes and the emotional weight of decisions made on the battlefield. For children, the experience of a siege left lasting impressions. Those who survived often bore the memories of fear, loss, and endurance for the rest of their lives. Some became chroniclers themselves, recording stories of courage, ingenuity, and suffering. These narratives, preserved through generations, serve as a testament to human resilience and the indelible impact of war on society's most vulnerable members. Ultimately, the Children of the Shadows remind us that siege warfare was more than a clash of armies. It was a total experience that engulfed entire communities, testing courage, endurance, and compassion. The young, the old, the infirm, all faced the consequences of conflict in ways both immediate and lasting. Their struggles illuminate the human dimension of war, providing a counterpoint to tales of strategy, weapons, and victory. In the shadowed corridors of castles under siege, children learned courage beyond their years. They adapted, endured, and sometimes thrived amid terror. Women and elders guided and protected them, forming networks of support that became the backbone of survival. These stories, often overshadowed by accounts of military heroism, remain among the most powerful reminders of the human cost and resilience in times of extreme adversity. As we reflect on the Children of the Shadows, we are reminded that history is written not only by the victors but also by those who endured. The echoes of their courage, suffering, and ingenuity resonate through the stone walls, silent yet unforgettable. In the heart of darkness, amid hunger, fire, and fear, the spirit of the innocent persisted, shaping the course of survival and the memory of sieges long after the last stone had fallen. As the siege dragged on, walls battered and supplies exhausted, the defenders knew that the end was approaching. The final hours of a fortress under attack were a crucible, where courage, desperation, and the will to survive collided in a maelstrom of blood, smoke, and chaos. This was the last stand, the moment when the fate of every soldier, civilian, and castle itself hung in the balance. The atmosphere in these final moments was electric with tension. Soldiers moved with grim purpose, aware that every corridor, staircase, and gate might be their last. Archers lined the battlements, drawing their bows for one final volley. Infantry braced themselves at choke points, ready to repel the inevitable assault. Even the walls themselves seemed to quiver under the weight of impending doom, echoing the fear and determination of those who defended them. Attackers, emboldened by the prolonged siege, pressed forward with relentless determination. Trebuchets and catapults rained destruction, while battering rams splintered gates and siege towers pressed against walls. The final assault was a symphony of chaos, clashing steel, screaming men, falling stones, and the roar of fire consuming wood. Every action was magnified in significance, as a single breakthrough could decide the outcome for hundreds trapped inside. Desperation intensified both heroism and horror. Defenders fought with a ferocity born of necessity, knowing that surrender could mean death, enslavement, or worse. They lashed out with sword, spear, and arrow, turning every corridor into a battlefield. Even the wounded continued to fight where they could, supported by comrades or sheer will. The castle became a stage for acts of extraordinary courage, as individuals chose bravery over survival in the shadow of annihilation. Civilians were drawn into the fray as well. Women, children, and the elderly took shelter in crypts, attics, and hidden chambers, but many were forced to flee through smoke-filled corridors, dodging arrows, falling debris, and panicked soldiers. Some assisted defenders by carrying water to extinguish flames or helping the wounded, their bravery often unsung but essential to the collective effort. The line between combatant and non-combatant blurred as the fortress became a single organism fighting for life. Close-quarters combat dominated the final hours. Battlements were stormed, gates splintered, and narrow staircases became choke points where a handful of men could hold off dozens. The noise was deafening, clanging steel, shouted orders, screams of pain, and the collapse of structures under siege. Defenders fought in every room, hallway, and courtyard, turning their homes into arenas of mortal combat. Every inch of ground mattered, and every moment demanded vigilance, courage, and sacrifice. Commanders faced impossible decisions. Should they concentrate forces at a critical gate, leave reserves to protect civilians, or attempt a desperate sortie to disrupt the attackers? Every choice carried life or death consequences. In some cases, leaders chose to fight to the last man, seeking glory or honor in defiance. In others, a strategic retreat to inner fortifications or a negotiated surrender was the only hope of survival for those who remained. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily, knowing that each decision would leave a permanent mark on the lives of many. Psychological strain was overwhelming. Fear, exhaustion, and grief collided in the minds of defenders. Friends fell beside each other, walls were breached, and the sounds of death echoed through every stone corridor. Yet even in this chaos, moments of clarity and heroism emerged. Soldiers protected comrades, civilians assisted the wounded, and commanders inspired courage despite the grim odds. The human spirit revealed itself most vividly when survival seemed impossible. The final assault often involved overwhelming numbers. Attackers poured into breaches, flooding the castle with relentless force. Defenders used every tactic, boiling oil from murder holes, fire, crossbows, and even improvised weapons. They sought to buy time, inflict casualties, and preserve honor. Each fight was a battle unto itself, a microcosm of the larger struggle for the fortress. Courage and fear coexisted, creating moments of drama that would be remembered long after the siege ended. As the walls fell, the reality of the siege became unmistakable. Defenders, cornered and exhausted, faced impossible odds. Many chose death over capture, fighting to the very end. Others attempted to escape through secret passages, hidden tunnels, or even the chaos of the battlefield outside. The castle, once a symbol of strength and safety, transformed into a landscape of peril, where every decision, movement, and breath carried the weight of life or death. Chroniclers recount the final moments with vivid detail. Gates splintered under repeated blows, towers collapsed under siege engines, and defenders fought in hallways drenched with blood and smoke. Children clung to their mothers, elderly residents huddled in corners, and soldiers made their last stands at doorways and staircases. These narratives capture the intensity, fear, and courage of the final hours, illustrating that siege warfare was as much about human endurance as it was about strategy or weaponry. The aftermath of the last stand was often devastating. When castles fell, survivors were frequently taken prisoner, executed, or enslaved. Looting, fire, and destruction followed the victors, leaving little trace of the lives and efforts of those who had defended the fortress. Yet even in defeat, the courage displayed in these final moments became legend. Stories of defiance, loyalty, and sacrifice were recorded, passed down, and remembered as examples of human resilience under the most extreme conditions. The last stand also served as a lesson in the stakes of medieval warfare. Every wall, every gate, every soldier and civilian mattered. A fortress's fall was rarely the result of a single failure. It was the culmination of attrition, strategy, and human endurance. The heroism of defenders, the ingenuity of attackers, and the suffering of civilians intertwined to create a narrative of extraordinary intensity. In reflecting on the last stand, one recognizes that siege warfare was more than mechanical or tactical. It was profoundly human. It tested courage, endurance, loyalty, and the ability to make decisions under unimaginable pressure. Those who fought to the end and those who survived demonstrated qualities that resonate through history: bravery, determination, and the capacity to endure in the face of overwhelming odds. And so, the last stand remains a powerful symbol. It embodies the climax of siege warfare, where walls, weapons, and strategies intersect with the rawest human emotions: fear, courage, desperation, and hope. It reminds us that behind every fallen fortress are the stories of countless individuals who faced the ultimate test of survival. Their struggles, sacrifices, and heroism continue to echo through the ages, a testament to the human spirit under fire. When the last walls fell and the battle was over, the victory came with a grim price. Sieges were not measured merely by conquest or territory gained, they were measured in lives lost, communities shattered, and the scars left on both the victors and the vanquished. The aftermath of a castle's fall revealed the true cost of medieval warfare, a price paid in blood, suffering, and shattered innocence. The victors often faced their own challenges. While triumph might bring spoils, honor, and strategic advantage, it also demanded responsibility, or ruthlessness. Decisions had to be made quickly: how to deal with prisoners, whether to spare civilians, and how to secure the castle for future use. Some commanders adhered to codes of chivalry, sparing women, children, and non-combatants. Others exacted brutal retribution, slaughtering defenders and looting treasure. The choices made in these hours shaped the perception of victory, leaving lasting legacies of both justice and horror. For those who had defended the fortress, the consequences were devastating. Survivors, if any, faced enslavement, execution, or exile. Families were torn apart, homes destroyed, and centuries of wealth and security wiped away in moments. The physical and psychological trauma was profound. Those who had fought valiantly often found their courage overshadowed by the loss and suffering that accompanied defeat. Even victory for some was hollow, as the human cost lingered long after the walls crumbled. Looting and destruction were common. Armies often stripped castles of valuables, burned supplies, and dismantled fortifications to prevent future resistance. Granaries emptied, livestock seized or slaughtered, and essential structures razed. The castle, once a symbol of power and protection, became a ruin, a stark reminder that conquest often left more devastation than glory. The human cost extended beyond combatants. Civilians endured the same fate, their lives uprooted and futures uncertain. Beyond immediate destruction, disease and starvation continued to claim victims. Siege conditions weakened both defenders and attackers alike. Contaminated wells, spoiled food, and crowded conditions created fertile ground for illness. Survivors often faced additional suffering from malnutrition, exposure, and psychological trauma. The human toll of victory could rival the battle itself, reminding all involved that war extended far beyond the final clash of steel. Yet, the aftermath was not solely one of despair. Some victors used their hard-won position to establish order, rebuild, and create stability. Castles were repaired, supply lines restored, and new governance established. Communities began to recover, often guided by the same resilience and ingenuity that had helped them survive the siege. The rebuilding process, though slow and fraught with challenges, was a testament to human determination in the face of devastation. Historical accounts often emphasize the duality of victory. Triumph brought prestige, political advantage, and sometimes wealth. But it also brought moral responsibility and the burden of witnessing suffering inflicted in the name of conquest. Chroniclers recount moments of heroism and cruelty alike. Leaders who spared the innocent, soldiers who protected civilians, and communities who showed extraordinary resilience. The price of victory was as much a moral reckoning as it was a measure of strategic success. One of the most tragic consequences was the fate of prisoners. Soldiers captured during the final assault were often executed or forced into servitude. Civilians might be enslaved or displaced, forced to abandon homes that had sheltered generations. Even when spared, the survivors faced the emotional scars of witnessing violence, loss, and betrayal. The human memory of a siege endured far beyond the stone walls, shaping the culture, literature, and collective consciousness of future generations. The psychological impact on victors was also significant. Witnessing the devastation, hearing the cries of the vanquished, and navigating the chaos could leave lasting trauma. Commanders who led brutal campaigns sometimes faced internal conflict, questioning the morality of their actions. Soldiers, too, bore witness to horror, their experiences shaping their perception of war, honor, and human nature. Victory, in its fullest sense, was rarely simple or unambiguous. The stories of those who lived through sieges, both defenders and attackers, highlight the complexity of medieval warfare. Battles were not mere contests of strength or skill, they were multifaceted events that tested courage, morality, and endurance. The aftermath revealed the full spectrum of human experience: bravery and cruelty, resilience and despair, life preserved and life lost. These narratives endure as a reminder that victory always carries a cost, often greater than the spoils gained. Societies were forever shaped by the consequences. Castles destroyed or captured altered political boundaries, shifted power dynamics, and influenced future military strategy. Families displaced or lost reshaped local communities, and the experiences of survivors informed cultural memory, stories, and laws. Every siege left an imprint not only on stone but on the human fabric of the region. The price of victory was written in both physical ruins and the lives of those who had endured its trials. Yet, within the tragedy, there was also a testament to resilience. Communities rebuilt, soldiers returned to their homes, and life continued amid the echoes of the past. Human ingenuity, courage, and determination proved stronger than the destruction wrought by war. Victory, though costly, often marked the beginning of recovery, adaptation, and the slow restoration of order. The price of victory teaches a sobering lesson. Every conquest carries human, moral, and societal consequences. Triumph in battle is inseparable from the suffering it inflicts, the responsibilities it imposes, and the stories it leaves behind. It reminds us that history is not only written by the winners but also by those who endured, suffered, and survived. The ruins of castles, the chronicles of survivors, and the memory of those lost all serve as enduring evidence of the heavy toll exacted by war. As we reflect on this chapter, we understand that victory is rarely pure or uncomplicated. It is measured not only by walls taken or enemies defeated, but by the cost borne by both conqueror and conquered. The legacy of a siege extends far beyond the battlefield, shaping the lives, culture, and memory of generations to come. In the echoes of shattered stone and human suffering, the true price of victory is revealed, leaving lessons for all who would seek to understand the human experience of war. Centuries have passed since the last great siege of Europe's castles, yet the echoes of those battles remain etched into stone, earth, and memory. The castles, once proud fortresses of power and protection, now stand as ruins, their walls scarred by the fire of conflict, battered by siege engines, and haunted by the stories of those who lived, fought, and died within. These echoes, faint, lingering, and sometimes eerie, invite reflection on the human experience of war, resilience, and survival. Visiting a ruined castle today, one can almost hear the distant clang of steel, the roar of trebuchets, and the cries of defenders and civilians alike. Every scar on a wall, every collapsed tower, tells a story of endurance, sacrifice, and tragedy. Travelers and historians alike have reported strange sensations, whispers of the past, imagined footsteps along empty corridors, the weight of history pressing upon the present. These are the echoes of stone, carrying the memory of human struggle across centuries. The ruins remind us that castles were more than stone and mortar. They were communities, homes, and centers of life. Within their walls, soldiers trained and fought, civilians lived and worked, and children grew up amidst both protection and peril. Each siege left a mark not only on architecture but on the people who endured them. In this sense, the stone itself becomes a vessel for memory, holding the echoes of laughter, fear, bravery, and loss. Archaeological studies reveal the tangible traces of these sieges. Burn marks on beams, collapsed walls, arrowheads embedded in masonry, and remnants of everyday life, pottery, tools, and personal items, offer glimpses into the past. These artifacts, silent yet powerful, connect modern observers with the lived reality of those who faced the extreme pressures of medieval warfare. They remind us that history is not abstract. It is rooted in the experiences of individuals, families, and communities. The psychological resonance of these ruins is equally profound. Historians and visitors alike report a sense of awe and reflection when walking through crumbled halls and overgrown courtyards. The silence of a ruined castle carries weight. It is not merely emptiness, but the lingering presence of countless human stories. Ghostly or imagined though they may be, these echoes remind us of the fragility of life, the courage of ordinary people, and the enduring consequences of conflict. Literature, chronicles, and oral traditions have preserved these stories, ensuring that the experiences of both victors and vanquished are not forgotten. Tales of heroism, sacrifice, cunning, and resilience continue to inspire, providing lessons on human endurance and morality. They offer insight into the complex dynamics of siege warfare, the interplay of strategy, courage, fear, and ingenuity that defined medieval conflict. Through these narratives, the stone walls speak once more, bridging the centuries to communicate with the present. The echoes of stone also serve as reminders of the cyclical nature of conflict. Castles fell, were rebuilt, and sometimes fell again. Each generation faced its own challenges, its own sieges, its own trials. Yet the lessons endured: the importance of preparation, the value of courage, and the profound human cost of war. Ruins are not merely remnants of the past. They are testimonies to the consequences of human ambition, resilience, and ingenuity. Modern visitors often reflect on the human aspect of these sieges. Standing in the shadows of collapsed towers, imagining the desperation of families, the bravery of soldiers, and the terror of children hiding in crypts, one gains perspective on the scale of endurance required to survive. These reflections transform ruins into living classrooms, offering lessons on empathy, resilience, and the complexity of human experience under extreme conditions. Even today, local folklore preserves the memory of these events. Stories of wandering spirits, strange noises, or inexplicable shadows in castles are more than mere superstition. They are cultural expressions of memory, a way of keeping alive the experiences of those who suffered. These tales, passed down through generations, ensure that the echoes of stone continue to resonate, connecting the past with the present in ways both tangible and intangible. The study of these sieges also provides insight into medieval society. The organization of defenders and attackers, the roles of civilians, the impact of strategy and technology, and the moral and ethical decisions faced by leaders all reveal the complexity of human civilization during conflict. Castles, once centers of power, now serve as windows into the social, political, and psychological dimensions of medieval life. Through their ruins, we learn not only about war but about the human spirit, adaptability, and the will to endure. Visitors who walk these ruins often note a paradox. Despite the destruction and suffering that occurred, there is also beauty. The architecture, the ingenuity of construction, and the harmony of the structures with the landscape reflect human creativity and ambition. Even in decay, castles inspire wonder and reflection. They are monuments not only to conflict, but to the enduring human desire to build, protect, and create legacies that outlast generations. In contemplating the echoes of stone, one also recognizes the universality of these experiences. Though the battles were medieval, the human emotions, fear, courage, desperation, hope, are timeless. The ruins speak across cultures and eras, reminding us that war affects all who live through it, and that survival, resilience, and memory are constants in the human story. The stone walls, though silent, carry lessons that remain relevant today. Ultimately, the epilogue of a siege is not merely the end of battle, but the beginning of reflection. The echoes of stone invite us to consider the full human cost of conflict. The courage of defenders, the suffering of civilians, the decisions of leaders, and the resilience of communities. They remind us that history is not only about events but about people, their lives, their choices, and their endurance. The ruins of castles are enduring teachers. They whisper stories of fire and famine, of betrayal and bravery, of suffering and resilience. They call on us to remember, to reflect, and to honor those who lived, fought, and died within their walls. In listening to these echoes, we gain not only knowledge of history, but insight into the human condition itself. As we leave the castle grounds, the wind through broken towers and the shadowed corridors remind us that the past is never entirely gone. The echoes of stone persist, carrying memory, warning, and inspiration. They speak of lives endured and struggles survived, of lessons learned at tremendous cost. The castles, though silent, remain eternal witnesses to the human spirit, the courage, resilience, and ingenuity that define our shared history. And so the echo of stone endures. It is the memory of those who faced fire, famine, and fear, the testament of children, civilians, and soldiers, the reflection of triumph and tragedy. It reminds us that history is alive in the ruins, resonating across centuries, and that the human stories behind every siege, every wall, and every scar continue to inspire, teach, and haunt us. In listening to these echoes, we honor the past and find meaning in the enduring resilience of the human spirit.